Welcome to the New York State Association of School Business Officials webinar. Today's program is the Financial Leadership in Support Services. Today's webinar is sponsored by Yankee Business Solutions. Your host for today is Donna Clement, Director of Professional Development. Operator assistance is available at any time during the conference by pressing £0. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may send chat questions at any time during the presentation using the chat window indicated by the speech bubble icon located to the right of your presentation. Please adjust chat questions to the Q&A group using the drop-down list located at the bottom of the chat window. I'll now turn the call over to our host, Donna. You may begin.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that you were able to make the webinar, and it's a good thing we're doing a webinar because the Capital Region, at least, and even some places south of the Capital District have anywhere from 3 to 6 inches of snow. So we're glad that we're all able to participate here. And like Judy said, this is the first of a two-part series on support services, and we're pleased to have Fred Seiler as our presenter. And Fred is the Assistant Superintendent for Business at White Plains Central School District. And Fred is also on the New York State ASBO Board of Directors. So we're pleased to have Fred as our presenter. And we do encourage you to ask questions. Anytime you hear something that Fred is saying and you'd like a little more information on it, jot that down, send that chat question, and Fred will either answer it then or we'll save it for the Q&A session that's at the end of the program. And now we are all set, and Fred, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Donna, and welcome, everyone. This is a two-part seminar and focusing on the support service areas. And next week, we're going to look at a lot of the people side of the business, and today we're going to look more at the financial numbers side of the business. And when we talk about support services, we're really looking at a couple key areas. We're looking at the business operations, and I know in some districts that involve the Human Resources Department. And then we're going to look at the three major support areas: food service, transportation, and plant operations and maintenance. I got a question last week as to how important I thought these areas were, and I think these are critically important for school districts. At this time of year, when we begin to develop budgets, we're going to have a lot of questions, I'm sure, in these areas, because too often people want to make sure that their student in the classroom is well taken care of, but they forget how important these support services are. In fact, I believe that for most children, the first person they see in the morning is that bus driver. And that bus driver is very key, I think, in walking that student on the bus, helping to have a good attitude about the day, and once again, helping to establish a educational environment for that student. And many of our students end up in school having a good breakfast provided by a food service program. And most students are getting a lunch program to provide them good nutrition so that they're in a good frame of mind and body to learn throughout the day. So food service provides a very important part there. And I often try to stress the importance that we have buildings that are clean, that they're safe, and they provide a very conducive environment for our students to learn in. So if you don't have good quality support services, it clearly impacts upon the learning of students. And I'm sure all of us, as we're working on budgets and addressing some of the challenges ahead, we're going to hear from Board of Educations and communities and so forth that you need to do cuts in the transportation area, or you need to do reductions in plant operation and maintenance, not realizing that those areas have a very important impact on student learning. So I think we want to share some ideas today that will hopefully provide some thoughts and ways that you can help in these particular areas here. So the focus of today, we're going to look at three major areas. We're going to spend the first 20-25 minutes looking at cost-effective determinations. We're going to look at some ways to really review our cost, provide some good financial analysis, and evaluate what we're doing. All of us get very, very busy. and we think about doing some of these type of things and some of these projects, and don't often provide good comprehensive data. So I'm going to give you some ideas, some suggestions. I'm going to give you some simple ideas here that you can expand upon in your school district. The second item we're going to look at is benchmarking for success. We need to look beyond what we're doing in our school district and do some comparisons with other school districts, because unless you see what other people are doing, you really can't determine how successful that you are there. So it's important to do some of those comparisons and measurements. And then the third area that we'll look at in the financials, look at some of the risks that you have in a school district and cover a couple of key areas, some things to look at, some ideas to help you manage that risk in the most effective sort of way there. I'm sure most of us have heard or read over and over again about how we should run your school like a business. In fact, the president of New York State, ASBO, in his most recent article, made the reference to that same type of comment there. And you'll hear that often from business people or board members or community members. Now, if you only ran your school like a business, they'd have much lower taxes and you'd be able to save all kinds of money. And there is some value to what they say, but in many times a school district and students are a very different situation than a manufacturing or a service organization. But I think we need to be prepared to give answers to people when they ask those type of questions. We need to be able to show them what type of job are we doing? How are we looking at some of our costs so that we can truly answer those questions. I think one of the things we want to look at is what your costs look like. Often we'll get questions at board meetings or with particular committees or budget committees. You know, how much are we spending for this and why is so much being spent for that? So I want to look at some ways with you that we can carefully look at our costs and be ready to deal with the scrutiny that's going to happen. I've been in this business probably 25 years, and I think this coming budget year for all of us is going to be one of the most challenging ever. We're going to be under the microscope more than ever before there. So we got to be able to answer those questions of how do we run our school operation? What are some of the qualities from a business sense that we do use that are effective? And what kind of job are we truly doing in managing our costs there? So I think part of this we want to look at how do we collect data and where do we get it from? What are some of the type of spreadsheets that we can develop? And then how do we review and analyze some of that data? Of course, the question often being asked of business officials is how effective is your work output? We need to find ways to look at some measurements. And one thing we're probably going to hear more than ever this year is how do we do more actually with less available? I think most of us are probably going to face situations where there's going to be fewer staff than perhaps we have this year. But the expectation by our parents and by our community and by our boards of education is that we can somehow do more and more with less available dollars. We're really facing a time where we need to squeeze every dollar that we can out of our budgets there. In the area I think people are asking us to look closely at first are the support services area. I think you've probably heard it as much as I have. You know, we need to trim back on our facilities budget, or we got to find ways to reduce that transportation budget there. We got to somehow spend less money on food because we want to make sure the kids have all the instructional costs and services that they need there. So we need to look at how we can very effectively manage our costs there. Like any organization, I think we need to begin by looking at some historical data. Need to be able to look at, and I'm suggesting what I've often done is look at the last 4 years of actual data along with the current budget. And I do this for every single budget code that I have in my budget there. But today we're going to really try to focus on some of those non-instructional areas. It's interesting when you begin to do this and you look at the last 4 years actual and the current year budget, you'll find some amazing things begin to jump out at you. I think the second part we'll look at is, what are some of those differences as we do those comparisons? And sometimes there's some very good reasons why this budget number is greater or less than the previous year. Sometimes there was a plan change in certain expenditures. A good example is if you're in your budget, you're purchasing school buses. Typically from year to year, you try to keep a number pretty much the same. But last year when things were a little tighter, you might have purchased one less bus because you could get by on that. So there was a reason why sometimes you plan dollars to go down or to go up there. Another part of this is very useful, I think, is to use some graphs. And I'll just share an example or two when we go through this webinar. But for many people, you can show them spreadsheets full of numbers. You can show them charts. You can begin to show differences in percentages. But often it's when you show them graphs that some of the numbers become meaningful to them. So we're going to look at some examples on that. And I'm going to start with a pretty simple example, partly because the availability of what I can get onto a PowerPoint there. But let's take a look at utilities here. I pulled some information from my current school district. And we'll look at a real simple spreadsheet related to utilities here. And I think what I want to stress on this is the concept is the important part. I think as you look at this spreadsheet, you'll see it's pretty simple, but it's something that you can prepare fairly easily on looking at many of your account numbers. This is what I do with pretty much all of my accounting activity there, where in this particular situation, I've looked at the last 4 years' actuals for the full school district and then this year's budget. And I've identified 6 major utility areas. Now, when I do this in detail, I'm typically doing this by building and often in much more detail. But just looking at the big picture here, and let's walk through the spreadsheet a little bit here. First line we're looking at is telephone here. And it's interesting, if you look at the actual numbers on telephone, you'll see that back in 2005, 2006, we spent $222,000, and then the following year, the number went up to $314,000, and then all of a sudden the numbers dropped down to $100,000 in the 07-08 school year and $82,000 last year. Now, anytime you work with a lot of data, it's important that you know the detail behind it. In our particular situation, in the 2007-2008 school year, we implemented a voice-over IP system, and we're able to significantly reduce our telephone cost, and thereby you're seeing a much lower amount there. Now you'll notice over here in the budget column, it still looks like a pretty healthy number, and that's because I think that's one of those areas where we've been able to kind of hide a little bit of dollars for the time being, and one of those areas that's hard to get a good grasp of there. But I think as we get a better handle on our telephone costs, that's probably an area that we'll begin to reduce down there. Another area to look at here is water. And we look at our water bill, for the White Plains School District, and in 05-06 and 06-07, it was $45,000, $43,000. And then in the 07-08, midway through the year, we suddenly were notified that there was a major increase in our water costs, which resulted in jumping from about $43,000 up to $72,000 and $73,000. Now, if you look at our budget column, we still haven't quite caught up to what was happening in previous years, so that's an item that we know in future budgets we're going to have to begin to bump up there. But you can see when you begin to lay out some data, you'll begin to identify where there are some significant changes. Now, a big area for all of us, and it's probably one of the toughest areas to get a handle on, is the area of electric, natural gas, or fuel oil. I think in most districts where you have that dual fuel capability, from year to year you may have a higher number for natural gas and a lower number for fuel oil, or vice versa, depending on the cost for that. You almost need to look at those together. Another key item when you're looking at the utility costs, obviously, is the usage, because while we have some control in trying to manage usage, we often don't have a lot of control when things are happening with OPEC or other parts of the world that's forcing up the price of gas and oil, which invariably impacts upon electric costs there. The one thing you need to look at when you're looking at utility costs is trying to get a handle on usage. Now, you can do a similar type of spreadsheet if you pull out some of your utility bills, and once again, rather than doing dollars, track your usage costs there, and it begins to tell you what are some of the changes there. That's a good exercise to do by looking at different buildings there. Once again, and I'll probably say this numerous times, you need to understand the detail so that you can make a good, informed decision. Sometimes there's very good reasons why dollars are higher or lower, and other times you're going to not have any good reasons and perhaps identify this is an area that you need to begin to look at there. One comment I've often heard that if you don't measure something or track it or look at the detail, you never know how good you're doing, and you won't know how to do better. So I think one thing that's important is really beginning to gather and maintain data and to do spreadsheets. It's only then that you begin to get a sense as to how well you're doing and how well you need to improve on some of those areas there. The spreadsheet I've given you is and I'm really encouraging all of you to take this type of format, only expand it significantly. Begin to look at a lot of your support service areas, look at your previous 4 years of activity, and then begin to look at what are some of the trends, what are some of the things happening. And often when you're doing this, you begin to identify what are some of the critical areas you need to begin to work on. Another thing that will probably happen invariably when you go through this process, numbers will jump out that suddenly you realize were coded into the wrong account. I think we work with thousands of numbers on a monthly basis, and it's not surprising that sometimes things might get coded to a wrong account there. But that's why it's important to look at the data, begin to analyze it so that you can begin to determine, what some of the expenditures are there. The next spreadsheet, and typically this is just added on to the existing spreadsheet, begins to look at some of those differences. And just taking our last spreadsheet and just looking at the last year of actual and the current year of budget, and you can begin to see some of the differences that begin to jump out. This is why I often think it's good to have 3 previous years to look at, because that gives you a little more history to look at to help explain why some of the differences are jumping out there. Now, once again, back to our example here. Here the telephone costs had an increase that looked like about 57.3%. Actually, the rate went up 59%, so our usage stayed pretty much the same there. The type of thing to look at there. It also points out when we did our budget, we need to continue to fine-tune it. I think one of the challenges for all of us is we're busy now in November and December doing budget information and hoping to do projections for 2010, 2011, when we only have several months of 2009, 2010 in the books there. And it seems like boards of education want budgets done sooner and sooner when we don't have as much information as we had in the past. Another good reason why to look at several years' worth of information there. So the difference column helps you to highlight some of the differences and then begins to help you look at where some of the areas to review this. Now, this information is often very good for internal purposes. What I mean by that is you don't often want your board or community to see large jumps necessarily in their budget presentations. But this gives you a chance to begin to dig in and analyze some of the data before it becomes something that you can probably roll up into a larger number for review by your community, your budget committees, and your board. But I do think we're all facing a situation where our community wants to see more and more detailed information because they feel like costs are not being managed as well as they would like. Our next example takes a look at a chart here. Once again, a pretty simple chart. You can do all types of charts. And take a minute here and we'll get the chart loaded in here. This is a chart looking at the utility budget. And once again, you can do this in a lot of your different support areas. But this is taking the utility budget for White Plains for the last 4 years in the current year budget. And it's interesting, you can point out, I think there was a lot of pressure on us last year that we ought to be reducing our 09-010 utility budget, even though a lot of the items we were looking at said that there was a lot of uncertainty out there as far as fuel costs. But you can see in 05-06, went up a little bit higher in 06-07, a little bit more in 07-08. And last year, I think most of us had a pretty good year when fuel costs began to drop and it wasn't too cold of a winter. It helped to hold down the cost there. But it's probably the one area when you're doing budgeting that you want to put some extra dollars aside. Most individuals understand the need to do that because if fuel costs rise significantly, there's no good place to make up that shortfall. That's one area you certainly want to try to find ways to put aside some extra dollar amounts there. Of course, now the key is how do we use the data? Because it's one exercise just to gather data, and a lot of times your staff can do that. But the more important thing is how do you use this information to gain some understanding? And that's where really financial leadership comes into play here. This is when you need to stand out and take this data and begin to do some things with it here. You really need to begin to do what I call dig into the data. As you begin to see some of the differences, too often you can run these spreadsheets and you can prepare some differences in percentages. But if you don't take some time then to begin to dig into the data and see what's happening, you then begin to gloss over what's happening from year to year, not really dig into the detail here. So I think the first thing you do is when you see some of those major changes, typically I look at either percentage changes that are either greater or lesser than 10%, or I'll look for dollar changes that are typically maybe 10,000 or so greater. It depends on what type of accounts I'm looking at. And then begin to dig in and find out what were some of the changes taking place there. One thing that's certainly going to happen is your communities begin to want to look at more of your data. They're going to begin to ask those questions. In my case, I have a new superintendent. He's very interested in getting into the data, and he's certainly asking those questions. I have a finance committee now that more than ever they want to dig into the detail, and they're looking for answers to those questions. Why are some of those changes significant? And this is part of, I think, building your credibility as a fiscal manager here, as a school business official, that you have the answers to these key questions. So it's good to prepare information for them, maybe do some charts, but you need to be able to answer the questions as to why where there are some significant changes there. And then once you perhaps identify some of those problem areas, the next step is then what are you going to do with some of those items there? Once again, look for some of those large dollar items. We all have a limited amount of time, and we know this is a critical function in each of our jobs, but it's often good to look at those areas that get your best bang for a buck. A good example about 2 years ago, as I looked at our costs for occupational and physical therapy services we were contracting out, and looked at what we were spending and how it was increasing from year to year. And that was an area that I thought we could have some significant savings. And I began to go through a detailed review process. Actually went out, did an RFP once we identified the problem area, and actually in a $250,000 in an area that we knew some large dollars were being spent. So really suggest that you identify a couple of those potential big areas that you can hopefully get a good bang for your buck there, that by taking some time to seriously address it, you can make a difference there. Of course, you need to look at areas that are somewhat controllable. Some areas are either mandated by New York State, or some areas are not the areas that are going to get strong support from your community. So you really want to look at those areas that you've got some control on and that you can do some work on. A good example is when you look at mileage limits on picking up students. And that's an area that's regularly talked about here in White Plains. Our elementary school, anything greater than a half mile we pick up, and anything greater than 1 mile for our middle school students there. People raise that question all the time as to look at that. But I also know that our Board of Education and a significant part of our community doesn't want to change that. They also realize it requires going out to a public vote. So it's not an area that I'm going to spend a lot of time and effort on. I know politically it's not going to go anywhere there. So you want to try to find areas that you can make a difference on and really identify some potential savings there. It's one thing to collect data and to begin to review it and analyze your data, and often look back how it's gone the last couple of years. And you'll often see situations where, there have been some significant changes that you want to focus into. But many times when you look at the data, it seems to be pretty much the same from year to year, and it looks like it's okay. But unless you begin to do some benchmarking for that data, you're not going to be successful in getting some of the changes there. And what I mean by that is you need to begin to take that data and to begin to look at some other school districts in your area. And in doing that process, you begin to see perhaps how good or how bad your success is in use of your data there. Now, this is a challenging, even though we're all in the education business, and we're all about seeing students get good quality instruction. Every school district's a little bit different there, so it's you need to be careful when you do some of these comparisons. But I think what's important is to try to identify some other school districts in your area. School boards are very good at this. Parents are very good at it. They want to know how your test scores are against your neighboring school districts. This is an opportunity for you looking at the support areas to say, well, how are we doing against our neighboring districts in some of the support services area? So it's often good to look at school districts in your area. Sometimes the size of the district makes a difference. Sometimes it doesn't. And where you're located. Now, if you compare a upstate school district to a school district downstate or Long Island here, you're going to find some significant differences. So that's probably not a good comparison. But often if you look at school districts in your BOCES, similar size, that's a real good opportunity to do some real measurement against each other there. Another thing that's often good to look at is some of the national or regional data. This data often is provided either through facility and operation magazines or studies or surveys, also transportation information. And sometimes that data can be very useful and very helpful. Other times you've got to be very careful. Now, a good number often shared is that for a good, clean school district, you need to have a custodial cleaner for every 20,000 square foot of building space. Some school districts like to push it up a little higher to 22, 23. my sense is once you get above 23,000 square feet of cleaning per custodial staff, you're going to find it very, very difficult to maintain a clean and safe organization. But that's a good national guideline that's probably pretty useful for all school districts to use. Another good area that's probably not good to use is utility cost. Obviously, if you're comparing utility costs to school districts down in the South, they're going to have a much lower heating cost than we would have up north. Even the differences between downstate and upstate are going to be different there in the use of utilities. So you want to be careful in that. Another area of cost you need to watch for is when you look at some of the dollar information. As most of us know, New York State is a very unionized state. We have a higher cost of living than most other states. So you got to be careful of using some of that regional or national data. But what you probably can do, once again, is look at the school districts in your area. Typically, the salaries paid, the cost of living, and so forth in your neighboring districts are fairly similar. So once again, by analyzing and looking at the districts in your area, it's a good way to review your level of success here. What you need to do, though, is you need to begin to identify some specific areas. And pick a common year that you're going to look at, common source of data, and look for ways for 4 or 5 comparable districts to begin to look at some data together in that particular area with the idea that you're all looking for ways to improve your operations and see how you measure up against one another in those areas. Now, got to look for those factors that are unusual. I know when I was working up in the Rochester area, and we would often look at utility cost. I was working in the Spencerport School District. Spencerport, Fairport School Districts both were part of municipal electric, in which our electric costs were about 1/3 of what other school districts were paying. A great benefit for those school districts, but we weren't doing anything particular to hold down our utility costs. We just happened to have a rate that was much lower than anybody else. So you want to be careful to identify some of those unusual factors or information there. Some of the steps you need to do now as we begin to look at benchmarking here. Once again, I think it's good to prepare a spreadsheet. Often ST3 codes are information that we typically use. It's often good to find at least 4 comparable districts. If you can get several more districts, that gives you kind of a richer source of data there. While historical data is good, you typically want to try to focus in on the most recent year of actual data. Once again, realizing that from year to year there can be some aberrations that's important to take into account there. What you don't want to do is you don't want to use budget data. Too often budget data doesn't reflect a real clear information as to how districts are actually spending money. So when you look at actual data, you're really seeing what was really spent in those particular areas. One of the challenges you'll find when you do this process, and I know you might find this hard to believe, but we don't always code things exactly the same way. And that may be some of the discussion you may need to have to make sure that you're looking at information that is fairly similar there. And that's why sometimes looking at a larger picture rather than particular counts makes this a useful exercise. And it's what you want to do here is focus on, once again, the non-instructional areas. Not that you can't use this exercise in the instructional area. Often the BOCES in a particular area helps to generate this data. I know down here in southern Westchester and Putnam County area BOCES here, we collect data out of our ST3 every year for the 41 school districts, and it's all gathered together and then shared out with all the school districts. It then gives us good data that we can really review and benchmark how we're doing against each other. When you do this now, it's important then to begin to look at things such as enrollment, sometimes budget or size of budgets, and square footage. And part of this process when you do this is to really work together to identify, which districts are doing really well in a particular area, and what are the areas maybe in your district that don't look too good that you maybe need some help to see what you can do a little bit better on that there. So a good part of going through this process is, to find ways that you can do a better job by benchmarking what you're doing against other school districts. Now let me give you a large example that was very useful with my school board and my finance committee. Last year, as part of a lot of budget discussions, once again, the concern was in White Plains we're spending over $10 million in our facility maintenance and operation budget there. And it's a huge number, out of control, and that we got to get our handle on that. And my sense is we were really doing a very good job of what we were doing, and that the number really wasn't out of control. So what I put together was a spreadsheet and identified, in this case, I think about 10 school districts in the area down here. And once again, using their actual SG3 information for their 1620 code for operations and 1621 for maintenance there, to look at a total operation and maintenance budget there. And then really compare that to the total expenditures of their operation there. And I think if you would do this, most school districts tend to fall between that 6 to 8% range there when you look at the operation and maintenance budget against the total budget. In this situation, we were able to show to our school board we really do have a fairly tight, frugal budget in that area as compared to our total budget operations, benchmarking against other school districts. So let's look at this a little bit, because you got to be careful. Go down here at the bottom, you'll see Harrison School District, and you look at those numbers there, and you'll say, wow, they're almost 10% of their budget for operation and maintenance. And it's helpful to understand a little bit behind some of the numbers once again there. Harrison School District, as an example here, has for many years been trying to have a capital project budget proposition passed there with, and they've not been successful. So what's happened the last 4, 5, 6 years there, they've had to do an incredible amount of building repairs and maintenance actually right in their operation budget because they've not been successful in passing a capital project proposition. The other end here, Tarrytown, White Plains, Ossining, the three up top here, they all have successfully over the last several years been implementing a capital project. And I think, as most of you realize, often when you're in the midst of a major capital project, a lot of those items that might be projects that you end up putting in an operating budget, you're able to pull out and include as part of your capital project budget there. That's part of what you need to look at. Other thing you need to do is, once again, I said school districts record items differently. Apparently, the Valhalla School District doesn't capture anything in their maintenance accounts, records everything in their operation account. I think that's a little bit of the quirky way that some of us do some of our recording there as to what is in the operations budget, what's in the maintenance budget. So that's kind of a caution when you begin to do some of your comparisons there. It's important that if you're trying to use this data to make good informed decisions, that you're truly, as best you can, comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges there. The other thing, and we're all pretty good at this sometimes, you can almost make numbers say whatever you want there. And you got to be careful, especially when you're doing your own internal analysis, that you're truly trying to look at real numbers and get a real picture of where you're at there, and not just trying to show the numbers that make certain things look good there. I realize when you're doing public presentations and looking to get budgets passed, you want to present things in the best light, but when you're doing your in-depth internal research, it's important to kind of take off the gloves there and dig in and really look at some real answers there and dig deep and find out what's really going on. So how do we use the information? It's one step to get out and to do some of this benchmarking. But what you really would need to begin to do is make sure you have good numbers. And it's often good to do this with a couple other neighboring districts so that you're each kind of working on a similar project there. Trying to make sure that you're doing a comparison. And then it's important to try to focus on specific areas. Whether you're looking at an operation, part of your maintenance and operation budget. Maybe you're looking at bus purchases. Maybe you're looking at food service operations and trying to compare what's happening between a food service program in one of your elementary schools versus what's happening in other elementary schools in your district or in other neighboring districts there. So it's good to try to identify an area that is of a concern and interest to you, and then to begin to do some of those benchmarks to gather some of that data. See how good you're doing as a school district as compared to maybe 3 to 6 other districts, or maybe where you're not doing quite as good, and try to find out some information on that. Another key part of this process is then to discuss this information with some of your key related staff. I find when I work with my facilities director or my transportation director or my director of food service program, they know a lot more of the detail of what's going on than I do. Often they'll be able to explain why some numbers look incredibly good. Maybe they're not as good as they look, or just the opposite. The numbers that might not look particularly good may be for a particular purpose in a particular time there. So it's good to work together with your your directors or supervisors in those areas, because they're going to be the key individuals to help come up with solutions on how to come up with some improvements on that there. Also, when you put together this information, it's often very useful to share with your superintendent and your board of education. As I shared a little bit earlier, when they were concerned we were grossly over budgeting and spending in facilities and maintenance, when we were able to share them some good data and benchmarking with other districts, they were able to back off a little bit. They still think that's the area we need to do our most cutting in, but they begin to realize that maybe it is a pretty efficient operation there. And the other part of using this benchmarking information is what's best used internally and what's best used then externally. What I mean by internally is what's the information you're working together on with your staff, or perhaps with your counterpart in some of your neighboring districts, as you kind of dig into the detail, and what's perhaps some of the information you want to share with your superintendent and the board of education. Now, I find sometimes when I'm sharing information in a public setting, rather than list the 5 or 6 neighboring school districts we're talking about, I'll just give them a letter and say we're comparing this against school district A, B, C, D, and E there. So we're not purposely pointing out what other district might not be doing particularly well there. Not sure what the situations where each of you are, but our newspapers love to stir up stories around that there. And we certainly don't want to make our neighboring school district look bad in any way there. And we like to work cooperatively together to help each other do a better job there. And then I think the importance then is to begin to define, what are the next steps then you're going to do once you begin to look at this information and identify some areas that might need an improvement. So let's talk about just a couple examples that you could be looking at here. I've done some of these in the past, and there's some of these I want to begin looking at in the future. One item under the area of your business office or financial operations, a group of school districts in our area are closely looking at what the staffing ratio is in our business office compared to the size of the budget there. One of our neighboring school districts, their board thinks they're grossly overstaffed, and so they've kind of reached out to their neighboring school districts here to collect information as to what's the number of people involved in purchasing, accounting, payroll, all the key functions within the business office, get an FTE count versus total budget there. Going through that process, I can see White Plains matches up against the other 8 or 10 districts part of the study here. And probably an area that I'll probably need to go back and look a little closer there to see, are we in the middle or are we in the high end or low end there? Another good area that I've never done, but I think it's a great area for all of us to look at, is the area of investment income here in doing benchmarking. What I mean by that is we all get real busy, and interest rates are terribly low right now. So we often will say why there's no need to spend a lot of time and effort trying to maximize our investment income. But would be an interesting process to look at, what's the amount of investment income we have versus our total revenue as compared to our neighboring districts, to get a sense as to, how successfully have we been maximizing our rate of return. We could find that's probably an area that we could be doing a little bit better in. And I think that's going to especially get true in another couple of years when, once again, interest rates start to get up a little bit higher there, and the rate of return is going to become much more important to each one of us. Lots of areas to look at in the area of plan, operation, maintenance there. I think the biggest one that is often looked at is staffing. School districts often look at, what's the amount of FTE that they're using to clean their buildings, and what's the amount of square footage that they're using. That's a pretty easy exercise to go through there. And once again, the national guideline is in that 20 to 22,000 square feet per individual, but a good number to look at there to see how well you meet up against perhaps your neighboring school districts or some regional or national numbers on that. A related number on that is what's the amount of grounds staff FTE for the number of acres that you need to maintain there. Once again, you need to look at the amount of fields and the type of grounds that you need to work on there. Another good area to look at in the plan operation maintenance is utility cost. That's an area we've been looking at a lot closer, especially since we're fairly close to beginning to look at entering into doing an energy performance contract there. And that's an area that's been of great interest to our community, and we're beginning to look carefully at our utility costs there. The real challenge in that is the condition of buildings that we might compare to. We have buildings as old as 1914 that is extremely energy inefficient to a brand new elementary school that is a green school and very energy efficient. So often the age of buildings need to be factored in when you're comparing with neighboring school districts. Another key part of that is when you do some of this analysis, this becomes information as to what might be items to be addressed in future capital projects, along with what are some of the things that might be done in the short term to control some of your utility costs. Other areas to look at is, what are you spending for plumbing or electrical or carpentry work or some maintenance repair type? How does that compare to some of your neighboring districts there? Might be eye-opening as to how big those numbers are when you compare yourself to some other neighboring districts there. Transportation has some good areas to look at, but there are some key factors you need to look at. Probably the biggest one is what's the square mileage of your school district. If you're a school district with 25 square miles to pick up kids, that's very different than a district that's got 125 square miles to pick up kids there. Obviously, you've got to travel a lot longer distances there. Also need to look at urban school district versus a suburban school district. In situation of White Plains, our total square miles is only 10, so it's a very low number, but we have significant amount of traffic, major expressways, major commercial center that makes busing a real challenge to get through those areas. Also need to look at how you're providing transportation. What are the mileage limits that you might be doing for pickups versus neighboring districts? What is your pickup process there, whether you're the guidelines that you're using, and whether you're doing double, triple, or triple tripping will make a major difference on your cost there. But those type of things are good to do some benchmarking against one another. In a couple of these situations, there are organizations out there that often can come in and do this type of study for you there too, and help you to see how you're doing in those areas. And I find that often you can present information to a Board of Education, or I can, but they often like to hear the expert who comes from 50 miles away, who this is their sole business, tell you what you're doing particularly good or not there. Fourth area, food service operations, and this was a good example where our board had some real concerns about the cost and efficiency of our food service operation, and we brought in an outside consultant, pretty well known in the area. He did a pretty comprehensive review of staffing levels and budgeting and actual costs and so forth, and then was able to tell our board that no, you do have a very good operation, and it is very cost efficient there. So sometimes that outside expert is very helpful to you there. A good thing to look in food service is looking at staffing levels. You can look at between your different cafeterias throughout your different schools. And once again, it's always a little bit different between an elementary school and a middle school and a high school there. But often comparing your staffing ratios against some of your neighboring school districts there to get a sense of what their levels are there. A big challenge I think we all know around staffing, and it's one of the difficulties in public schools, is because these are unionized employees, often well protected. We often find a situation where you almost need two people to do the level of work of one of your best quality workers there, and you've got no easy way to get rid of that particular poor performers there, which ends up costing you additional dollars in staffing. But we'll talk more about the people part of this when we come to next week's webinar there. Looking at food cost in your program and food service program, see how you compare to some of your neighboring districts there. Hopefully, if you're participating in both these bids and you're all participating in similar bids, you would find costs should be fairly similar. So it may not be a purchase item, maybe more of how well you manage and use your food. These are just some of the areas you can begin to look at in trying to identify areas to do some benchmarking. How do we build for success? Well, I think what you want to do is do some of this benchmarking, and then you need to identify who's the best district in that particular area. Who's the shining star out there that seems to have been doing great things and has got the best results there? What I've often found is when you do this with a couple of districts, you'll find that districts are good in different areas, and that gives the opportunity for when you're good in a particular area, you can share your strategies for success with another school district. And if someone else has got some really good ideas on how to do it, then they can share with you, and together you're hopefully both getting better at how you manage your support services there. So it's good to identify who's really the expert in an area. And then, once again, what I think is very good about school districts, we usually are very helpful and cooperative to support one another and help everyone get a little bit better there. Once you begin to identify what you'd like to do, you want to establish some targets and look at some specifically measurable areas and look at what you can do to get better in that particular area. Because if you don't set a target or something to shoot for, you lose some of the motivation how you can get better on that. And then you want to begin to evaluate on a regular basis, whether monthly, quarterly, or annually there. Now let me take one area to close this particular section that we've spent a lot of time on, and that is in the area of plant and operation and maintenance overtime. That's been a concern of our Board of Education for several years. The New York State Controller came in and did an audit about 2 years ago, and that was their primary area they focused into. They thought our overtime cost was far greater than what it should be, although when we shared, once again, some of that benchmark data of some of our large neighboring districts, we found we were pretty much in the middle there. But we still identified this was an area that we could work on. Then we began to develop some strategies on how we could reduce some overtime. And we talked to some other districts, and we explored some ways that we could really create some improvement in that area. So some of the things that we've begun to implement, and perhaps you've done some of these, in each of our buildings, we took one individual and changed their schedule instead of a Monday-Friday schedule to a Tuesday-Saturday schedule. I'm not sure what it's like in your school district, but our buildings are heavily used 6 days a week. Invariably, every Saturday, there's something scheduled in all of our buildings. And by then having someone as a regular schedule working on a Saturday, we're able to reduce the overtime costs there. Of course, when I talk about the heavy use on Saturday, in our union contract, any work after 6 p.m. on Saturday gets paid double time. So what we've conveyed to all of our outside users is buildings are only open until 5 o'clock on Saturday. And at that point, they'll be closed and are not available except in rare situations after 5 o'clock on a Saturday or on a Sunday. And thereby, we've begun to reduce some of that double time that we were paying for some of that later use there. Another area we looked at was the building checks that happen on our building on any holiday or any Saturday or Sunday there. And we were having a situation where every building was checked for 2 hours by one of their staff, which was a nice little bit of extra overtime for them, double time on Sunday. And now we reduced that down to where we're looking at just a couple individuals doing the entire district and saving us almost 50% of our time for building checks there. We required individuals who needed overtime, especially for weekends related to facilities, to have requests submitted by 12 noon on Wednesday so that our facility director could closely review and decide whether they would approve them or not. One thing that came out of our audit from the state was too often our principals were asking facility staff to work later or come in on Saturday, even though they had no direct responsibility for the budget for that. And that's something we changed there, where principals could no longer could ask for that. It had to go through the director of facilities or myself if they had a particular need on a weekend. And the next item we're doing is our assistant superintendent for human resources and myself are beginning to carefully look at the overtime numbers on a monthly basis, who's using it, how much, and for what purposes there. And now we're providing regular reports to our Finance Committee and our Board of Education. When everyone knows you're reporting this information on a regular basis, there's a much greater emphasis in trying to control your costs. Now, we had a New York State Controller come in to do a follow-up audit about 3 months ago, and we actually got a very good finding because they saw that we were able to reduce our cost almost 30% from the previous time period they were reviewing. And in this year's budget, we've even set a more challenging target to reduce that cost there. That's a good example of taking a particular area, doing some benchmarking, developing some strategies, setting some targets there, and then reviewing on a regular basis. And in our case, we've seen our overtime costs drop almost $400,000 from 3 years ago there. Last section we want to talk a little about is analysis of some of the risks there. This can be a challenging topic for business officials because by nature we are very, very cautious and careful individuals. In fact, in our profession here, there's very little reward for taking any risk. In fact, the penalties often are pretty severe for making a bad decision or taking a risk there. So we typically want to be very, very safe than to be sorry there. But I do think during these challenging fiscal times, it requires us to demonstrate some good financial leadership. What I mean by that is I think it's important that we make smart decisions, but we really become good fiscal leaders as we analyze some of the risks in our school district. And I'm going to just highlight 4 or 5 key areas. Not going to go into great detail. The first area we're going to look at is in the area of insurance, and we could easily spend a couple hours just talking about all the aspects of insurance. But just a couple key points. When do we need it? Well, I think we know the school district needs to be properly insured in many situations. But where we get into trouble sometimes is those outside user groups. We had a situation in White Plains about 7 or 8 years ago where at the last minute the Board of Education thought it would be good to let a particular group use a particular field, even though there was no insurance in place. And as would happen here, a student got injured fairly severely, and a significant dollar settlement ended up being a liability for the school district. Or since then, now no one even thinks about using any of our facilities unless we can demonstrate that they've got the proper level of insurance in place there. So you want to make sure that you've got coverage when it's needed there. Another area that's rather interesting is student accident insurance. It's interesting, about half the school districts in New York State purchase that and provide that, and the other half basically do not. They basically tell parents that that's going to be that we don't carry it as a school district, and that they need to be responsible for themselves for any accidents that happen to their particular son or daughter there. Two ways to look at that. In White Plains, we do purchase student accident insurance, and it does work out fairly well. On my previous district expense report, we did not purchase it, but I did set aside a sum of money every year that would help me deal with any of those small little situations where I didn't want it to get into a liability situation and potential legal costs that would help to pay for that rather than purchasing insurance there. There's also some significant difference between upstate and downstate. So when you clearly downstate's a much more legal environment. You need to maintain much higher levels of insurance because you're dealing with lots and lots of legal costs down here. Deductible is a good thing to talk about. I mean, if you think about insurance, you want to provide insurance for what you cannot reasonably cover. As fairly large school districts, we can cover really a lot of the small items, so that if you set your deductibles fairly large, you're able to reduce the amount of your insurance premium. So in White Plains, we typically use $5,000 as our deductible, and we just handle all those small type losses just within our budget there, and then are able to save some significant costs there. Keep in mind on the time here, let me look at a couple more areas with you here. Equipments and buildings. Service contracts. That's clearly an area that companies are regularly trying to sell you to put into place. And I had actually two of my sisters work very heavily in the whole warranty service contract industry. There is a extremely high profit margin in that area. There are some areas that I would say copiers, HVAC systems, you clearly want to have service contracts to maintain those large type items. But most equipment type items, I would recommend that you're spending far more in service contracts than you'll ever get any return on your dollar there. That's one area that you may want to take a little more risk on, an idea to save some dollars there. RFP for type of services. Often we get lulled into working with the same company year after year, and I have found recently, and I'm a guy who likes to do a lot of RFPs, when we begin to create a competitive environment, when we begin to invite other companies to get involved, invariably the prices come down there. And when you do that, you're getting better quality for your dollars there. Preventive maintenance is another area I think that better to spend dollars up front to maintain information or maintain equipment, maintain your buildings and so forth, than to be paying a lot greater dollars in the long term there. I think the other area you need to look at is electrical cost, carpentry, plumbers, those type of things. Sometimes it's easy to be paying contractors and consultants to do that work, Sometimes it could be cheaper if you have employees that are skillful to do some of that work. So that's the type of thing I think each district needs to look at as a way to control some of your support services costs there. And it's a good area often that with smaller districts that you work together with a couple other districts, perhaps to control some of your electrical or carpentry type costs there. Consultants, where many consultants are the instructional side, you sometimes have contractors or consultants supporting the support services area. I think while you do RFPs often for these type of things, the quality of the service is probably, I think, one of the most important things that you're looking at. I think all of us have dealt with different types of firms, whether they're architectural firms or construction management firms, security services, things like that. You need to look at the quality and are they meeting your expectations? Are you providing the service that you need? Sometimes you're paying a little bit more to get the better quality, and in reality you're saving some money in the long term. But are they worth the money that we're paying for them? These are areas I think you need to look at doing bids or RFP services on. Sometimes we take the quick and easy route and just purchase items off a state contract pricing. Syracuse University did a study about 4 or 5 years ago that looked at services that were provided to state contract versus through bid and RFP, and found that in most situations, districts were able to save money by doing bids or RFPs, even though it does take some additional work. That's the type of thing I think if you're going to provide good financial leadership and support services, you need to kind of go out on the limb and do those type of things to maximize your quality of dollars there. And then you need to look at what's the ability on your staff there. I think often we haven't maximized the expertise that we have there on staff to do things that they could do a good job for and save us some dollars. I think people closest to what we're doing are often our best expertise than bringing in someone from the outside who is looking at it maybe with an experienced eye, but not knowing your particular situation. We'll talk next week a lot more about things related to staff and employees here. But this is an area you can really get into trouble if you don't do right there. I think our most valuable asset that we have in a school district is our employees. And the process that you take in recruitment is so critical to getting the right individual. Too often we get an employee and they do okay and we keep them, and next thing you know, we're stuck with them forever. And so I think the one thing I would stress in this area is you go through a quality recruitment process to get the best individuals you can. And unfortunately, in these challenging fiscal times, there are often some very good individuals out there really interested in providing you good quality work for a school district there. Reference checks, we're all told we should do them. We often get lazy at doing them. I had a situation, I won't mention the school district, but I was a little surprised to hear that they hired my assistant transportation director to become their new transportation director. Nice guy, very capable, but not of quality that you'd expect to be a transportation director. And I mentioned to my fellow business official that I was surprised they didn't even do a reference check there, and they were in a hurry and they wanted to get the person going. And he came back to me about 8 months later and he said he so wished he had done that reference check because it absolutely did not work out. All the things I pointed out, came true, and they had to start the process all over again there. So the importance of reference checks. We'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but we're expecting our employees to do more for less here in the coming years here. So we got to continue to raise that bar of our expectations for them there. Got to do that in a positive, motivational type of way, but they're our greatest asset, and many of them just love to be challenged to that higher level there. And then the fourth area here, and your HR person probably regularly reminds you of this, the importance of doing evaluations. I think for two things. One, to help your good employees get a little bit better, to help to identify the things that they can improve on, but also for those employees that aren't meeting up to expectations, you're beginning to establish that paper record that is so critical if you need to get to the point where they're not meeting your requirements as an employee there. The last area I want to talk about a little bit when we talk about analysis of risk is in investments. We all obviously have to meet all the state requirements. The state controller defines to us, along with state education department, all the rules and regulations that we have to follow. And it's very important that you in no way compromise on that particular item there. But the other thing I try to point out to other school districts is you need to look at maximizing your options. You should be working with anywhere from 3 to 4, 5, 6 banks, 2 other state organizations, New York Class and NILAF. Both are other options for you. As I've looked over the past 3 or 4 years, I've been moving my money between those different organizations depending on who was able to provide me the best rate of return in a safe environment to meet my particular needs. And I think every school district needs to look at those particular options there because the investment interest rate market continues to change. Sometimes banks can be very competitive, and sometimes it's a New York Class or an ILAP that can provide you better options. So those are easy items to set up, and I really think every district ought to have 3 or 4 banks at a minimum as far as investment options, along with these 2 state organizations. Gives you the ability to maximize what's the best alternative to that situation. And no matter who you're working with, especially with banks these days, you want to make sure that your investments are meeting all the safety and collateral requirements. Over 100 banks in this past year have failed across the United States. So there are some banks out there that are not good, credible organizations. So you want to make sure you're dealing with quality banks there. One of the challenges, I think, with making investments is you need to know how much you can tie up for what period of time here, especially when you begin to look at the options of CDs. I think a little while ago, it didn't matter where you put your money, the interest rates day to day were as good as anything else. But in the last year or so, often you can be getting a greater return on a CD for 90, 180, or a full year there. But you can't do that unless you've got a good cash flow that's updated on a regular basis to determine what it is that you can invest on. You need to make good investment decisions. This is a situation where I think we've often been too safe, maybe a little lazy at times, when we could be doing more to maximize that return. And while there's not a lot of money you can earn in investments right now, it's an area that's off into the future as interest rates begin to creep up. That will be a good source of revenue for school districts. At this point, we've come to the point for questions and comments. I'm going to turn it back to Donna to facilitate this part.
Okay. Thank you, Fred. You provided a lot of great information. We do have 2 questions, but before we take those, Judy, if you could please remind our participants how they can ask a live question.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we will conduct the question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please press 7# on your phone now, and you will be placed in a queue in the order received. Please listen for your name to be announced and prepare to ask your question. We're now ready to begin.
Okay. Now, our first question comes from Mary Gibson, and she said that she missed what the POM acronym stood for. So if you could remind us again and talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have a tendency in education to use a lot of acronyms, and different school districts have different terms they use. Some use O&M for operation and maintenance. POM stands for plant operation and maintenance. So what we're really describing is the entire facility operation. The grounds, the maintenance, the custodial cleaning is all part of your overall plant operations and maintenance budget there. Plant being referred to pretty much as your overall buildings.
Okay. And the second question that we have, and we encourage others to just key a question in because there's so many topics here. Shelley Matisse is wondering, when you're talking about insurance, do you think that release of liability forms are worth the paper they're written on?
Interesting question, and most attorneys would say that they're very important, and if you don't have them, then you've really increased your liability somewhat. So I always find it's good that you've got a release of liability form that your attorney has helped craft there that they feel comfortable with, and by then having the other party sign it, it gives at least our lawyers a chance to hold them liable for actions that may happen when they're responsible for a particular organization or an event or activity. So invariably, you may still end up in a lawsuit, but at least having that form signed begins to help define who's responsible for that particular circumstance.
Okay, thank you. There's always issues with insurance, and you really need to make sure that you know your policies and what they cover. While we're waiting for other questions and comments to come in, is there anything else, Fred, as you were going through this, saying, here's another area I could have talked about, or here's something else that I could have mentioned?
Now, let me think for a minute about that. I think the thing that jumps out to me a lot is, as I've been in this business of schools for some time, is we've got a lot of great people, and they've got a lot of great ideas and expertise, but we just get so busy and bogged down with our day-to-day activity that we just don't find enough opportunity. We find some, but enough opportunity to share with one another how we're tackling some of the challenges. And that's why I like to stress the importance of doing benchmarking and doing it with several other districts, because when you begin to do that, you begin to learn from each other, and that helps both school districts to improve there. And I know that's tough when we are really challenged. Our days are far too long. There's so many things to do, but I think we're missing out on some key opportunities to come up with some of those improvements there.
Yeah.
Another thing I would share, and I shared this recently with our Board of Education, which I thought was rather interesting and perhaps a bit bold on my part, and that was that while it's important to provide them with good information and provide them what they need to make good decisions, too often boards of education and finance committees, superintendents, can have you spinning your wheels in so many directions that are not real productive. And so when you can open up the opportunity to be able to have that dialogue and say, well, I really would like to focus my efforts on this particular area because I think it can save us some real dollars here, but I'm getting caught up with some other things that probably are not going to be as meaningful as far as dollar savings, and perhaps get your board or superintendent to say, well, maybe we'll hold on that particular interesting project or study that I wanted you to spend time in, so you could focus your efforts on something that might really save us some real dollars, and that's going to be critically important, I think, in this coming year. And when I shared it with my Board of Education, I was almost a little surprised when they said, please tell us when we're asking you for stuff that you don't think is going to be real productive in saving dollars there. So maybe being a little bold sometimes might be helpful in controlling that amount of time that is so limited in all of our lives.
And I think you're so right. There has to be trust and respect, though, with that board, with the administration, to do that. But also sometimes you need to let your superintendent know so that the superintendent can make those kinds of statements. So it all depends on the board, but I do think you're so right. And many board members appreciate the fact that say, okay, because at school boards, they're always talking about micromanaging, and some board members don't want to get into that, and some of them don't realize when they are or not. So certainly a good point.
Yeah, and you brought out a good point about credibility there. I could not have that conversation with my board 2 years ago when I was fairly new here.
Mm-hmm.
It was only after I've been here 3 years and was able to build some credibility and demonstrate some good quality work, I think that it opened up the avenue to have that kind of conversation with your board there. So you need to do some good things and show them that you're working hard and trying to do some results to build that credibility with your Board of Education and your superintendent there.
Definitely.
We do have a live question from Gail.
Oh, good. Okay, Gail, what is your question?
I was just checking as I was looking over the topics that were to be covered in our 2 sessions. I just wanted to make sure, were we going to be doing some of the in-depth things like that were listed under food services and transportation? It talked about menus and prices, routing and scheduling, inspection, things like that. I just wanted to double check.
Yeah. Not in these 2 webinars are we going to get into that particular detail.
No, but we do have, we did a food service workshop last year that was very well received, and we have some good information. And we can look into doing something like that again and providing that kind of information for you.
Okay. Thank you.
These two webinars are really focusing on that support services and that staff. And the first one here is leadership, and then the second one is going to be more of the people skills. But it's all of support services in general. And at other times, we're going to be talking about transportation and food service. A point that came up in the Fall Business Management Workshop was with Marian Edict, and she talked about transportation contracts and how so very important they are becoming. And we're actually going to have a session at the Summer Business Management Workshop on contracts for transportation. So that's a tidbit that only you on the webinar now know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Fred, I think you covered a lot of areas. I think your benchmarking is right on. Certainly the support services areas are important, and they all of that function deals with students and deals with faculty in such a different way than in that classroom setting, and it can make a difference in the culture of the school and the acceptance that everyone feels in their building and the pride and so on. So I do think that this is a very good topic, but this certainly was all of the financials and support services we know so often deals with so much more of the people aspects. So we'll really be looking forward to that one for next week.
Yeah, the one thought I have is I always think support services staff that you're working with are real people.
Yeah.
They're the people that live in your community. They've got so much common sense sometimes it's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the teachers. They do a great job for our kids. But if you want to get some real answers to real questions, go to your transportation area and sit down with your drivers and talk about budget issues with them.
Mm-hmm.
Or sit around with some of your custodial staff. They give you some incredible good day-to-day common insight that you don't often get. They're your real people, I think, from your community.
Yeah.
They provide great insight.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they do represent the community in many ways, and they're the ambassadors, and we always need to remember that. So any last bits of information that you'd like to share, or any teasers
thank
about
everyone for for participating, and hopefully I'm always open for anyone who wants to call or send me an email to share ideas. I'm glad to participate in that way.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your good information. And we also have our sponsor, and this is the first class that is being sponsored. And we just received a message here from Mary Gibson. Is there an assignment for the class?
What I really would encourage everybody to do is to begin to generate some of those spreadsheets, at least to start with there, and looking at some of your support service areas. Look at your similar to what we showed in the 4 years of actual and this year's budget, and begin to look at some of those comparisons. And hopefully you begin to identify a couple areas that you want to look at a little further there. And the second thing I'd encourage individuals to do, and of course you need some partners on this, is to look at doing some benchmarking. So if you identify an area that you want to look at, either see if you can get information from BOCES or have other districts share that information. So it'd be interesting to see